I think I reviewed about 1,000 video game controllers over the years. It certainly feels like it. Fighting sticks and gamepads and driving wheels and accessories and everything in between. And about half this stuff was for the Sega Genesis because of the power of blast processing. So sit back and relax. Prepare to enjoy Best Controller Reviews by Classic Game Room. Volume 1. 1 of Infinity. There's like no end to these things. So I'm testing out the new Allen 9000 modified Sega Dreamcast arcade stick using my Sega Dreamcast and a bit of GigaWing. Best played on a CRT monitor if you have one for the fastest reflexes. Tell me that just doesn't look cool right there. Here is a mighty Sega Dreamcast controller, the likes of which the universe has never seen before until now. It's the Allen 9000 modified Sega HKT 7300. I previously reviewed this controller in its stock form, and it was a great controller. It's a very good joystick for the Sega Dreamcast, good for fighting games and spaceship shooters. But over the years, the buttons started to stick, and I contacted my friend Alan, who makes those awesome Allen 9000 controllers. You can buy them on eBay. He makes controllers for the Master System and the MSX, and he said he'd take a swing at modding the buttons for my Dreamcast controller and doing something cool with the stick, and here it is. Looks great. The Allen 9000 modified Dreamcast controller. The stick was in pretty good shape, so he didn't replace the arcade stick, but he did put a new ball top on there, and I believe these are Sanwa buttons, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I'm probably not, but those of you who are into this stuff probably know what I'm talking about. Needless to say, they don't stick anymore, and they feel great. And I did some reading on the internet, so this was actually a pretty tricky thing to do, which is why I knew I couldn't do it. I'd have made a mess of it. And Alan said it was pretty tough, but here's a close-up look at the buttons, which look and feel great. These feel as good as they look. And I actually used this controller just last week to get my high score in GigaWing on the Sega Dreamcast. So watch the original review, and you can see what this controller looked like previously. It just had green buttons. But I opted for a Sega Dreamcast look. In fact, I told Alan to be creative, and he suggested this, and I said, yes, that sounds perfect. I love the ball top. That's really nice. So if you need a Dreamcast stick modded, I guess Alan is your guy. Just Google Allen 9000. As a Dreamcast fanatic, I absolutely love this thing, so thank you again, Allen 9000. I'm actually not sure if he's taking other mod jobs, but you can find him at allen9000.com, and he does great Sega Master System controllers. I reviewed one of his a couple months ago and use it for all of my Sega Mark III and Master System reviews. The cool thing about this controller is that it plays as good as it looks. And it looks spectacular. It really needed new buttons. The buttons were the weak link on this Dreamcast controller. The arcade stick, the HKT 7300. I'm pretty sure that Sega just pulled numbers out of a hat when they were assigning them to their various products over the years. I was planning to actually do this mod myself until I read about how difficult it is, because I think you had to drill larger holes for the new buttons, which is not something any schmuck like me can do. The stock HKT 7300 is a good buy if you find one on eBay. They're not inexpensive. You can also find some other controller options out there, like the X-Arcade has a Dreamcast adapter, for example, and that's also a good choice. But nothing looks as good as this. It's just a shame it doesn't have wood grain, Alan. That's a high score, at least, for the day. Thanks. Oops, can't spell my name. Thanks to the Alan 9000 Enhanced Dreamcast controller. I'm putting pressure on Alan to do this kind of treatment with Intellivision and Atari 5200 controllers. Because the Dreamcast arcade stick was actually a pretty good stick to begin with, even though the buttons just needed replaced. But the Intellivision and 5200 controllers, someone should go back in time and reinvent those things. So Alan, if you choose to accept that mission, that's what you need to do. Go back in time. Please prevent them from putting keypads and crappy controllers and joysticks on those things. Also, I feel like this needs a wood grain plate here that says Alan 9000. Just going to throw that out there as a future possible modification, Alan. Nothing says awesome like wood grain. Vanished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the Intergalactic Space Arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Welcome to Classic Game Room for a super fun review of the Thrustmaster T300 RS. Become the administrator of driving games. This racing wheel is so Lando. From Thrustmaster, thrust your way to victory over and over and over again with the Thrustmaster T300 RS racing wheel and pedals for your PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3. How much thrust can a Thrustmaster thrust if a Thrustmaster could master thrust? Quite a bit, it would seem. This is the wheel to get if you like driving games and have a racing seat. Do not try to use it without a racing seat. It'll just break your coffee table and your will to live. This wheel seriously thrusts. The force feedback is incredible, and of course that varies depending on what game you're playing, but for the good ones like Assetto Corsa and Gran Turismo 6, it's simply the best racing wheel I've ever used. And I have it bolted to an R seat. Something like a play seat will also work. The wheel has a switch so you can change it between PS3 and PS4. The wheel is incredible. Sadly, the pedals aren't quite up to the same standards. They feel a bit cheap, which is why they sell higher-end upgraded pedals. That I also have, I'll show you those later, but the stock pedals, while acceptable, are not nearly as good as the wheel. Disregard my dirty socks and the dog hair. I find that socks are the best way to use these things. They require a delicate touch and I can't stop her from shedding. This thing is a dust magnet. But still the best racing wheel out there. I've used a lot of wheels over the years. Cheap ones, really cheap ones, middle range ones. This blows them all away. You connect it to your PS3 or PS4 with a USB cable. You'll probably want an extender for that. Another plug goes into the wall, so it's kind of annoying having wires all over the place, especially if this is in your game room or living room or something, but it's still totally worth it if you play a lot of driving games. The T300 RS is really in a league of its own. The only reason you may not want this is price, because not only do you need the wheel, but I really highly recommend a seat as well. But this is like the closest you'll get to driving without actually driving, so pour a beer and hop in that multi-million-dollar Ferrari, because this is video games. You can't crash and die, except you can break your wallet, which you probably will, but it's worth it. If you play a lot of driving games. I've used this with Assetto Corsa, which I've shown in this review, Gran Turismo 6 obviously, Drive Club, Dirt Rally, and F1. Assetto Corsa probably uses it the best. You feel every little bump on the road. If you crush an ant, you feel it. And you hear the scream, especially if it's one of the ants from Earth Defense Force. I'm gonna run that guy off the road, because frankly, he doesn't deserve to share it with me. Off the road, off, there you go. EDF, woo!
The left 6 over jump. Caution, left 3.
Some games are definitely better than others. I really couldn't get it to work all that well in Dirt Rally, but it kicks ass in Gran Turismo. But most of these games have settings that you can tweak and tailor the wheel's thrust to your liking. And everything about this wheel is to my liking. It really is remarkable. I think it's worth the price, although I wish the pedals were a little bit nicer. They're not a deal breaker though, they just feel like the same kind of pedals you'd get with a $60 wheel. Dog hair covered dirty socks, not included. They're DLC. The motors or whatever they use to create force feedback are working so hard that the fan in the Thrustmaster is like a jet engine, giving you some extra satisfaction that thrust is being mastered. Can you hear it? It's still making noise. This thing has quite a fan on the inside. In any event, Thrustmaster will be happy to sell you new pedals, which, again, I'll show you in a later review. Because I've got a huge Thrustmaster-sized classic game room shout-out and thank you going to Kelvin once again. Thank you for sending this to the show. I've had a great time with it. So much, in fact, I couldn't even bring myself to disassemble it and remove it from my basement. Another reason I really like the Thrustmaster T300 RS is that it makes me feel like Speed Racer. I just drove off the road. You know why? Because I was thinking of Trixie still locked in the trunk. Whoops. So once again, thank you to Kelvin from Cuba, Missouri. This has been wonderful, and hopefully I've persuaded some of you to pick up a Thrustmaster T300 RS. You won't regret it. The only racing wheel that comes close to topping this thing is the Steel Battalion controller. But that was kind of different. So real, I imagine he's behind me. Whoa! Whoa! Hey now! Good thing I have insurance. Welcome to a special, exclusive Classic Game Room review, a re-review of one of my all-time favorite controllers. It's not nostalgia, it's that good. It's called the NES Advantage, and it gives you the advantage in countless games on your Nintendo Entertainment System. When I first reviewed this back in 2008, I used my old Canon PowerShot, and it's blurry and it's dark. I filmed it on the couch in my old basement. This time around, I'm going to film it in space, with space-age technology. But the results will be the same. It's a great controller that you want to own. The NES Advantage. Feel that space-age music. I love the NES Advantage. This was such a cool controller back in the day, and as I'm recording this 30 years after its release in 1987, it's still my favorite Nintendo controller. I use this for almost all of my NES game reviews, Famicom game reviews, and direct feed footage for Game Boy and Game Boy Advance reviews. I plug it into the Retron 5. Built like a tank and designed like a good-looking tank with red buttons, the NES Advantage is eye-catching and functional. The big red buttons feel good. The turbo fire was so rad back in the day. I love that you can fine-tune the speed of the turbo fire with the knobs. You can play 1 or 2 player games with the NES Advantage. It has 2 plugs built into it. And there's slow motion so you can cheat. Forget the Konami code with the NES Advantage. Well, no, the Konami code was actually quite helpful. Disregard that. The NES Advantage didn't give you that much of an advantage. It was just far superior to the NES gamepads, and this crushed the aftermarket junk from back in the day. The NES gamepads weren't even that bad, but this is the Advantage. I mean, just look at it. It gave you the frickin' advantage. And this came from an era when this kind of aftermarket controller just was not mainstream. These days, you go online. I mean, the internet didn't exist in the 80s. These days, you go online, you can buy those monstrous, hoary fighting sticks for your Switch or your PlayStation 4 or something. Back in the day, they just didn't exist. You were really lucky if you got one of these things. I have no idea how I talked my parents into buying one. Like, there's no way that I could buy one. I must have begged, or I don't know. Sadly, this kind of controller was not available for my beloved Atari 7800, but this was one of the big selling points for the NES. I mean, it had stuff like this. Nothing else had stuff like this. It looks cool. It still looks cool. This is arguably my favorite controller of all time for any video game console. Maybe, depending on what day it is. The Sega Genesis gamepad is pretty awesome, but this is the Advantage. Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the Intergalactic Space Arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Stupid ass food. Good morning, nice Ian's guys to drop by for the review of the ColecoVision Super Action Controller. Look at this thing. It's the controller I would bring to a bar fight in Mos Eisley. But can it play games? Let's find out. Damn, that thing's strong. Just like my coffee. This is the standard ColecoVision controller, the one that came with the ColecoVision that looks like a telephone, the one everyone has, the average controller. And do you want to be average, or do you want to be super action ColecoVision controller person, user number one? I want to be that one. Well, at least I did until I used it. But more on that later. This is the coolest looking controller I've ever seen. It has a handguard, which means they were anticipating game rage. You can punch out your opponents with the controller, strike fear into the hearts of your enemies, and then lose the game because it's actually not as good as the standard controller. It's true, it's a really awkward joystick, but definitely one that you should own, if for no other reason than you can start a bar fight with it. This is the controller you bring when those kids are having a PS3 versus Xbox 360 argument, and you want to punch out both of them. The ColecoVision wins! I like that this thing also resembles a Star Trek phaser. If Khan were playing ColecoVision, he'd be using this. While I would be using the Atari 7800 gamepad because it's actually way better, but this definitely looks the part. But does it deserve the name Super Action Controller? I gave this thing a nice road test, starting out with one of my favorite ColecoVision games, Gorf. While this thing is totally functional, it's just kind of awkward. The way that you hold it is strange. This is back from the early 80s, before they really figured out how to design gamepads. So game companies were trying to find ways to put arcade joysticks on things, and there's just no really good way to do that unless it's an arcade machine. Or unless you build it into a brick like one of the giant Street Fighter controllers or something. So here I am using it for Frenzy, and it's just exhausting to hold this thing vertically with one hand and then try to aim with the other. Not to mention, it's extremely touchy. If you want to shoot left, you'd better aim exactly where it wants you to aim. Otherwise, it'll shoot diagonally. So it's not too bad for some games like Gorf. It actually works pretty well for Gorf. But Ladybug is downright unplayable because it requires too much precision, and I constantly felt like I was just wrestling with it to keep it straight in the first place. So it's not bad for Gorf, and actually it works pretty well for Q*bert. So if you're living in 1982 or 1983, you might want to consider this, if for no other reason than it does play Q*bert better than the standard ColecoVision controller. And Q*bert's a pretty awesome game, so there's nothing wrong with that. It also played Burger Time pretty well, which you saw at the beginning. It works okay for Defender, but it's not great. It's just kind of an exhausting controller. The best way to use it is to drive it into your leg for additional support, which stabilizes the joystick. Quick, everybody into the helicopter, I'm saving you. Not because I care, but because I want the points. It's worthy of the name Super Action Controller because it is better for some games like Frogger. And it's definitely better in a bar fight. So a huge thanks to Ben from Buffalo, New York for sending this to the show. Is it as super as a plate of hot buffalo wings that play games? Well, I don't know because I don't think that exists. But it is super action-rific, the ColecoVision Super Action Controller. It's better for some games than others, but damn does it look cool. I would drop him out of the helicopter so fast if it would give me a bonus, but it doesn't, because I'm fighting for freedom. Previously on Classic Game Room, I reviewed the Analogue Interactive CMVS Slim, which is a consoleized Neo Geo MVS video game system. Well, how about the matching controller? This is the Analogue Interactive Analog Arcade Stick for the CMVS Slim or any other Neo Geo game console. I've tested this extensively on the CMVS Slim and the Neo Geo CD game console. They all have the same plugs. The Analogue Interactive Analog Arcade Stick is made from solid wood. It has an 8-way joystick and the 4 buttons that you'll commonly find on Neo Geo game controllers. Here's the technical information about the parts used to make this controller. Same components as the Japanese arcade cabinets. Here's a close-up look at the joystick and the reflection of the camera. And here's a close-up look at the buttons, which feel like really nice arcade quality buttons. And I absolutely love the joystick on this controller. This has a removable controller cord, and the start and select buttons are on the back. Here's the underside of the Analogue Arcade Stick, which has little rubberized feet to keep this firmly planted on your coffee table, which will probably not have the same build quality as your Analogue Arcade Stick. So now they need to make matching coffee tables. Like the Analogue Interactive CMVS game system, this is an expensive controller for Neo Geo enthusiasts, but it can be used on any Neo Geo, the AES, the Neo Geo CD, or the consoleized MVS. And with the substantial price tag comes substantial build quality with good components. This thing is solid, it's heavy, it's a really nice controller. And for the price, it should be. Here's a close-up look at the wood finish, which will show some wear and tear even after moderate use, so you'll want to have the furniture polish handy. If you want to keep this looking in mint condition, prepare to clean daily, or at least not touch it with your fingertips. Perhaps you could buy 2 of them. One for show and one to use. If you want more information about this, visit their website. As of this recording, there's 2 finishes available to match their CMVS game consoles. I used this controller for a bunch of games and some fighting games, as well as for the reviews of Shock Troopers, Windjammers, and Sonic Wings 2 and 3. But what if I like to play my Neo Geo games with a standard gamepad? Will Analogue Interactive be there for me and create a solid wood Neo Geo CD gamepad? that's even heavier than the Analogue arcade stick. Maybe they could fill it with dark matter and shattered dreams. Banished from Earth, classic game room broadcasts from the intergalactic space arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Welcome to Classic Game Room. I've reviewed a lot of badass controllers on this show over the years, but never before have I used an arcade stick that plays games on the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and PC Engine. Let's all enjoy the review of the Fighting Stick Multi from Hori. Why do the Japanese always get the best stuff? From controller manufacturer Hori comes the Fighting Stick Multi, which plays games on multiple game systems. And since I can't read the packaging, I'm glad that Mark attached this post-it note. Thanks, Mark. One fine controller for many great game systems. This is like a jack of all trades if the trade is being awesome. Because this thing plays even better than it looks, and it looks pretty good. The build quality looks and feels substantial, the buttons are great, and the 8-way joystick is really nice. However, it may not work like you think it does. There's no switch to indicate what game system you're playing. Instead, you physically attach a specific cable. It comes with 3 of them, and you don't want to lose them. This is pretty clever, works really well, and I'm assuming it kept their production costs down. You plug in the controller cable for the game system that you're going to use. Assuming that it was invited to the Hori Fighting Stick Multi-Party. So Gamecom collectors, too bad. Don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. For the rest of us though, this is great. And while there's no shortage of good controller options for the Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, or PC Engine, this is the best arcade-style joystick I've used for any of them. Today, I will be playing Musha on the Sega Genesis with the Fighting Stick Multi. Yes! And drinking Sex Panther. Good beer makes everything better, even a good controller. As you can see, it looks spectacular and it plays just as well. It's substantial, it's responsive. If you love fighting games and spaceship shooters on these game systems, honestly, it's worth it. I don't know what else to say except thank you, Mark and Suzanne from East Meadow, New York, once again. Thank you for this incredible controller. And thanks to Daryl from Arizona for the beer. Sex Panther enhances everything. No room for my Sex Panther. You know life is hard when the Panasonic 3DO is so full of Sega Genesis cartridges that you can't fit your beer on top of it. There we go. Plays games and acts as a giant beer coaster. I even like the odd 90s styling of this thing. None of their design elements seem to work together, but somehow that works, considering it plays games really well. Cheers, everyone. This is an exciting segment because I'm reviewing 3 things at once. This will go into 3 different reviews. I'm reviewing Sex Panther beer, which is fantastic. The Hori Fighting Stick Multi, which is equally fantastic, plugged into my Super Nintendo, where I'm going to play Thunder Force 2 for the Sega Genesis using the Retro Gen on Super Nintendo, while fueled by Sex Panther and this awesome controller. This is seriously a great day.
Now I shall play Trusted in the R-Zone using the Fighting Stick Multi from Hori.
This is actually kind of an odd angle to use this controller, but I'll do what I can. For science! It's now time to play some Gate of Thunder on the PC Engine using the Hori Fighting Stick Multi. What a great controller. One of these days I'll play a fighting game with it. The Hori is such a badass controller that it gives me ample room to mount the GoPro directly to it. I love this shot. It captures how much fun I'm having. Great game system surrounded by great systems with great beer, and a wonderful controller that I'm so happy to have. Now I shall actually play a fighting game with the Fighting Stick Multi. Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo. Gosh, which character to choose? It's a great 6-button controller, seems to work just as well on Super Nintendo as it does on Sega Genesis and PC Engine. What I need to do is brush up on my Street Fighter 2 skills with these instructional laser discs. Oh yeah, I'm filming a review of those things. Sadly, the Fighting Stick does not work on the Laserdisc player. Or the Atari 5200, a game system that could really use a good controller. You've got plenty of great gamepad options and even some other fighting sticks for the Genesis, SNES, and PC Engine, but nothing like this. The Hori Fighting Stick Multi. You know, I didn't try it on the Panasonic 3DO and Atari 2600 yet. I should do that soon. It'll be a separate review once I get out of the R-Zone. Thanks again, Mark and Suzanne, for the controller, thanks to Daryl for the beer, and thanks to Hori for making another fantastic controller. I've been loving this thing while playing a lot of Musha lately, so enjoy! Great game, great controller. Doesn't get much better than this. Thank you for watching. Follow Classic Game Room on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Patreon. If you enjoyed this review, then you're gonna love my review of Musha on Sega Genesis. Watch it now. Just when I think I've seen everything when it comes to video game controller technology, they install a fan to keep your hands cool. It's the Airflow for the Xbox 360 from PowerA. Hey, if you can install a fan to cool your hands, can you install a flamethrower to heat them up? Maybe next time. The Airflow does the opposite of what the flamethrower does. It cools your hands with a pleasing breeze. And I used this controller to play through Spider-Man Edge of Time, so you can watch its performance during my review of Spider-Man Edge of Time, although you probably won't notice any difference at all because it feels nearly identical to a standard Xbox 360 controller. It has a rubberized surface on the sides and obviously the cooling fans which you can turn on or off. It is a wired controller and you plug it into your Xbox 360 using the USB connector. They give you plenty of wire. Here's a close-up look at it. The thumbsticks are nearly identical to the standard Xbox 360 controller thumbsticks. Whoa, that's bright. Hang on. They offer slightly less resistance and the D-pad is more of an old-school style D-pad. You may have noticed the extremely bright lights emitting from this thing. The Airflow is the controller you can use to blind your friends if you're playing in a dark room. It's like a flashbang on a controller. The top left button turns the light on or off, and the top right button activates the cooling fan, which has 2 speeds, low and high, which blows air through the slotted vents on the side of this thing onto your hands, preventing them from getting sticky and sweaty like a standard controller. To some degree, the air vents combined with the rubberized surface actually make this a very comfortable controller. The fan vibrates a bit, so you will notice that, and as you can hear, it's also quite loud, maybe amplified a bit during this review because I'm pointing a shotgun mic into it. If you have this set to the high setting, you will most likely hear and feel the fan. I actually found the low setting to be the most practical and effective. It's a comfortable controller, and if you find your hands getting hot and sweaty over time while playing games, you might want to consider this. If anything, it makes for a nice second controller, and I do like the fan. I could do without the LEDs, but the fan is extremely cool. Haha, pun intended. It's the Airflow. As good as the original old school PlayStation controller was, if you wanted something with more of an arcade feel, you have to go with a different controller. Here's the ASCII-ware PlayStation arcade stick, which is about the same size and shape as the old school PlayStation, the old gray one. On the back of this thing they call it the ASCII Stick PS from ASCII Entertainment, and if you look on the top left here it says ASCII-ware with the PlayStation logo on the bottom. I'm very, very happy with this arcade fighting stick, and this works really well for fighting games on the original PlayStation like Tekken 3, Tekken 2, and the Street Fighter collection. It works with the PlayStation 2 as well, which is actually what I use it on. Could you hear that? Could you hear that it's an 8-way joystick? It's a pretty solid aftermarket arcade-style joystick. Feels very similar to the larger Sega Saturn or Sega Genesis arcade stick. Feels somewhat hollow, but it still sticks to the coffee table fairly well. If you have this on a coffee table, you can also use some adhesives if you want to make sure it's not sliding around when you're playing some fighting games. I like the oversized arcade-style buttons. They work very well for fighting games, and the joystick itself is also very well designed. If you take a close-up look at these things, you can see the 4 standard PlayStation buttons flanked by L1, L2, R1, and R2. In some games like Tekken 3, you can assign in the game various functions. I have R1 assigned to do that. I have R2 assigned to do that, which really helps out when you're trying to grab players or pull off some special moves in fighting games. Most of the time I feel like these are unnecessary, but these do have turbo and auto functions that you can assign for each of the individual buttons, and you can adjust the speed of the turbo. It also has over here slow motion on and off. There's your select and your start button. There's some decorative plastic molding here on the side which does absolutely nothing except sort of replicate the look of the original PlayStation. Well, I'm typically more of a gamepad guy when playing fighting games. For Tekken 3 in particular, I really enjoy this because of the assignable buttons. And the Tekken games in general, you're not doing a whole lot of various swings and loops and whatnot. It's more button combinations. So I think this one works pretty well for that. And people always want to see how the joystick plays for certain games. So if you watch my Tekken 3 review and my Street Fighter Collection review, I talk about this joystick and I'm actually using it in those game reviews. We'll look at it from the front here. You can see this is a fairly sizable joystick. It really is about the same size as the actual old school PlayStation, which I no longer have. I use this with my PlayStation 2 and it works perfectly. It does not have a rumble function. It's not an analog joystick. That's why it can click. If we look underneath, it has some rubber feet which help with sticking it to the table. If you push down, it actually does sort of stick a bit. And if you're looking to buy one of these things, here's some information for you. Nice solid metal bottom. Overall build quality seems fairly good. It feels like one of those Sega controllers for the most part. Except it's not. That's where the wire comes out. You get a fair amount of cable with this. And as you can see, it's all tangled up right now, as a standard PlayStation plug that works with your PlayStation or PlayStation 2. And I have not tested this with any peripherals to see if it works with the PlayStation 3. It has a similar style to the Sega Saturn arcade fighting stick, and that's got a wide open area here. You can rest your hand on it. And even over here, it's a big joystick. You can just definitely lean into this thing. 4 buttons on top, 4 buttons on bottom. Pretty solid joystick. No frills. These don't cost all that much these days because nobody's buying PlayStation 1 accessories anymore. Why not? They work with the PlayStation 2 just fine. So if you want to pick up some old school fighting games and challenge your friends to Tekken 2 again, get this thing. The ass-kicking-ware PlayStation joystick. ASCII-ware. I think they should have called it the other thing. I have the PlayStation arcade fighting stick laid out next to the Sega Saturn arcade fighting stick, and you can see that these are roughly the same size. They're both gigantic, enormous controllers that you can lean into with both hands The big difference between these two is that this one does not make a clicking sound with the joystick, whereas the PlayStation one does make a clicking sound with the joystick. And here's a standard DualShock controller so you can see the immense size of these things. Just hang out and stare at that for a while. Many of the older PlayStation games do not work with the analog controllers on the DualShock controller, and the gamepad doesn't really replicate an arcade joystick. This does. The PlayStation ASCII-ware joystick arcade fighting thing. I'm still not sure what the actual name is. I should just make one up. The ass-kicking ware fighting stick. Only on Classic Game Room. I made it a little happier. We all know that Hori has made some pretty good controllers over the years, like this thing, the Hori Vuelix RAP4 Premium Fight Stick, which is so large that it contains the controller that I'm reviewing in this review, the Hori Fighting Commander PC for the PC Engine, which is a fabulous aftermarket controller option for your PC Engine with 6 buttons, perfect for Street Fighter II. The standard PC Engine controllers only have 2 buttons, which really isn't enough to get the job done when you need to kick and punch people in Capcom's classic arcade game, which rocks the PC Engine. No! Nobody eats Chun-Li's head and lives! It also has turbo fire and slow motion, and it's just a really nice controller. Let's take a look. I previously reviewed the Hori Fighting Stick Multi for the PC Engine, which also works for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. That's a great controller option, but if you're looking for something that's more of a gamepad, which is roughly the same size and shape as the Super Nintendo controller, get this thing, which is a great gamepad. However, it's not inexpensive. Now, odds are if you're collecting for the PC Engine, you're used to things which are not inexpensive, because the PC Engine and its games are pretty pricey for the most part. But you get what you pay for here. This is a great gamepad. I love the switches, I love the buttons, I like the D-pad. I like the styling. You can choose between a 2-button and a 6-button layout. You can select which buttons are turbo and which aren't, and you have 2 different speeds of slow motion. The Hori Fighting Commander PC even gives you a decent length of cord. What more could you ask for? No, it's not compatible with the Vectrex. Actually, that is what I asked for, but it is compatible with Truxton, or at least Tatsujin on the PC Engine, where that slow motion switch comes in really handy because Tatsujin is way faster than Truxton on the Genesis. You know, because Truxton wasn't hard enough, let's make it faster. The Hori Fighting Commander PC gets the job done. It's great for a wide variety of games. I've been using it for Street Fighter II, Bomberman, Gate of Thunder, Tatsujin, Road Spirits, Final Zone 2, a whole lot of games. When the arcade stick is just too much, I go for the Hori Fighting Commander PC. Of course I win. I'm using the Hori Fighting Commander PC controller with 6 buttons and a comfortable D-pad. I'm not sure how many games use the 6-button layout for the PC Engine, but you, my friend, are an asshat. Obviously, it works with Street Fighter II, and that's what counts, because that's a great game. To the curb, Zangief! Like the guy over here drinking the vodka in the crowd. I mean, I'm assuming that's what it is. Which sucks with 2 buttons. You need 6, or at least 4, but definitely 6. More than 2. That's what yeah, that one. So once again, I've got a classic game room shout out and thank you going all the way to my man Mark and his wife Suzanne from East Meadow, New York. Thank you for the PC Engine and this excellent controller, which I highly recommend. It's not cheap, but it's worth it. The Hori Fighting Commander PC. I'm not proud, but it does work.
The telephone gets down many doors, thank you, all over the world.
Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the intergalactic space arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Welcome to Classic Game Room, where I'm looking at the Street Fighter IV Mad Catz Fighter Pad for fighting games and spaceship shooters. Let's see how it works. From accessory maker Mad Catz, it's the Street Fighter IV Fight Pad featuring a giant picture of Ryu and some Street Fighter IV badging. This is the Xbox 360 version. You can also get these for PlayStation 3, and according to eBay at least, you can find one of these featuring other characters and even different games like Street Fighter Cross Tekken. As you can see, they moved the button placement around a bit to make it work better for fighting games and omitted the dual analog thumbsticks. In their place, they added a giant picture of Ryu screaming at you, or maybe he's just talking about how this was quality control passed by Inspector 10. It's a good-looking gamepad. I kept calling it the Fighter Pad, but actually it's the Fight Pad. And the best thing about it is the D-pad, which we're getting a close-up look at here. It's excellent. Works really well for fighting games, arcade games, and spaceship shooters. This is a relatively affordable controller that is wired, so you'll plug it directly into your Xbox 360 with a USB cable. Then you feed it games, preferably fighting games or arcade games. Don't try to play first-person shooters or driving games with it. That's not what it's meant for. Now, most of my Street Fighter games are on PlayStation 3, so I went with the King of Fighters 13 here. I played a number of games, and you know, for the price, I really like this gamepad. I think the D-pad is excellent. It works really well for fighting games where you're trying to make arcs and Z movements and stuff. The shape and feel of it is very comfortable, like a giant Sega Saturn or Genesis gamepad, and the button configuration is also a huge improvement over the standard Xbox 360 controller for these kinds of games. And by these kinds of games, I mean games where you want a good D-pad, not games where you need dual analog thumbsticks or trigger buttons. So even though this is called the Mad Catz Fight Pad and features a picture of Ryu from Street Fighter, it could also be called the Mad Catz Spaceship Shooter Pad, because it works pretty well for those too. So how about a classic game room shout out and thank you all the way to Canada. Ronald from Oakville, Ontario sent this to the show, so thank you, Ronald. You can easily find these online. It's the Street Fighter IV Mad Catz Fight Pad, which has a nice D-pad, comfortable buttons, and it was quality control passed by Inspector 10, who's way better than Inspector 9. That guy sucks. Welcome to a special Classic Game Room, because this is the 2017 re-review of the N64 controller, the Nintendo 64 controller. Love it or hate it, it is unique. And while the Nintendo 64 has grown on me over the years, I've actually found a lot of great things to love about the N64. The controller is not one of them. However, I think it's an amazing piece of video game history. In the evolution of the video game controller as we know it today, the N64 is kind of off on its own, and you've got to respect it for that.
Woo! Look how much fun we're having. It's festive. It's a party. When you line up all of these multicolored N64 controllers, it screams Mario Kart 64 or GoldenEye 4-player action. I love how they could apply pretty much any color scheme to these things, and it works. You have to respect Nintendo for trying something really different with the Nintendo 64 controller. It's like 3 controllers combined into one, and it doesn't really work in my opinion, but if you grew up with one of these, I imagine you're far more accepting of its unique and interesting design. It looks like some kind of spaceship out of one of the Star Wars prequels, which of course just reminds me of Jar Jar, but you should be able to take one of these things and stab Jar Jar in the face with the 3 points. This is how my mind works. So you've got the thumbstick in the middle, and the 2 little grippy things on the side that you can hold on to. In theory, it should be awesome, but in practice, I don't like the thumbsticks. I never have. They're kind of mushy, they're awkward, and the Z button in the middle is also just unusual. But back in the day, playing GoldenEye, it was like the only thing that I knew at that time for the N64, so it works just fine. It's just you have to rethink things these days when every controller looks more or less like an Xbox 360 or PlayStation controller with the dual thumbsticks. In a way, the Nintendo 64 controller has a lot in common with the dreaded Atari 5200 controller, or the Intellivision Disc of Pain, or the ColecoVision controller back when game companies were trying new things in the early 80s, before the NES gamepad set the dominant style for the next decade. These other companies like Atari and Intellivision came out with these odd designs that had fire buttons on the side and keypads, and they didn't work. They did not work well. Now, years later, before the dominance of that DualShock style, of the Xbox 360 style, Nintendo created this, which is like a hybrid combination of the Super Nintendo controller and the very beginnings of the modern thumbstick style controllers. Remember, when this came out, it was years before the first-person shooter genre was one of the dominant genres. So people just weren't used to moving your character around with the left thumbstick and aiming with the right one. At the time, we made do with this. You couldn't use a mouse and a keyboard on the N64. At least I don't think you could. I didn't have one back in 1997 when I was playing GoldenEye. In just a few years after the N64's release, we saw the PlayStation DualShock controller, the Sega Dreamcast controller, which only had one thumbstick as well, in more of a modern position than the Nintendo 64 controller. But look how they managed to place all of these buttons on this one controller. This is a lot of buttons for one controller. Now, these days we're kind of used to that, but when this was released, we were just coming out of the era of dominance, of 16-bit dominance, with Sega Genesis controllers and Super Nintendo. This is a huge departure from a 3-button Sega Genesis controller, or even the standard 4-button with the 2 shoulder button Super Nintendo controllers. If you look at the evolution of video game controller design, the Nintendo 64 is on its own island. It's a unique entity, if you will, and I respect that. Years later, Nintendo would redeem themselves by creating the wonderful GameCube controller, which is also quite unique and somewhat different than the modern PlayStation DualShock or 360 style controllers. Even though it starts to approach that design mentality, the Nintendo 64 controller is a love it or hate it controller when you get down to it. You can put any shell on this thing. I love the see-through model that we're looking at now. The orange see-through is great. Looking at the innards, it's like we're seeing into its soul. I think the memory card placement is excellent. I actually like controllers that hold the memory cards, like the Dreamcast controller does the same thing. I think that's a great way to store your memory cards. I always find it annoying on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 that you have to sort of try to wiggle your controller in beneath the memory card. That's super irritating. It's way easier to just plug your memory card into the controller, so kudos to Nintendo for doing that. Now after this, Nintendo would release the GameCube and then the Wii with the Waggle Me Wiimote. It's a hate it or hate it controller, and then the Wii U, which was even worse than that, now with the Nintendo Switch. I think they're back on track, and they've basically just gone in the same direction as everyone else with the excellent 360/DualShock style design with something like the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Even the Joy-Cons snap together into a modern controller configuration. But years earlier, we got this, the bright orange Pikachu Nintendo 64. And its unique, festive controller. So you're hanging out with your friends, you're playing some Mario Kart 64, everyone's having a great time until Jar Jar Binks walks in the room. This review has been approved by Lord Carnage. Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the Intergalactic Space Arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Oh yeah, feel the smooth bass, it's the Sega Genesis, which does not work with the blue PlayStation 4 controller, but you know it wants to because it's so damn sexy. And the PlayStation 4 controller looks good too. Dressed up in an attractive blue finish, it's a slightly different color than the standard model. I think if you're going to have more than one controller, they should be multiple colors. That way, you know which one's your favorite, and you give your friends the old one. Now, I'm a big fan of the PlayStation 4 controller. It's an improvement over the PlayStation 2 and 3 controllers, which were pretty damn good too. Sadly, it does not work with Sega Genesis, but that's okay because the Sega Genesis controllers are amazing and they cost a lot less than this thing. Prepare to feel the burn if you're going to pony up for another PlayStation 4 controller. They're not inexpensive. At least you get a good controller for your money. It looks good, it feels good, excellent build quality, nice D-pad, good buttons, and the analog sticks are great. It's also got a little speaker thing on the front of it and that touch pad, which is, well, it's there. Here it is side by side with the standard model black one that came with my PlayStation 4, and as you can see, the blue one is bluer and newer. The other one's gotten some abuse, but it still works just fine. Annoyingly, the PlayStation 4 does not work with the 15 or 6, no, I have more than that, I have like 30 PlayStation 2 controllers. Throw me a bone here, Sony. Let me use my PS2 controllers on the PS4. Or at least let me use my PlayStation 4 controller on the Sega Genesis so I can enjoy Mega Turrican with another excellent controller. And a blue one this time, which complements the red and yellow on the Mega Turrican cartridge nicely. That's right, kids, maybe you don't always play PS4, but when you do, you should have a Sega Genesis nearby. And a blue controller. If you're going to be rocking the Sega 32X on top of your Sega Genesis with games like Cosmic Carnage, the standard 3-button Sega Genesis controller may not cut it, even though this is possibly the greatest video game controller ever made. It's 3 buttons too little to play Cosmic Carnage. You need a 6-button Sega controller. There's numerous Sega Genesis 6-button controllers out there to choose from, like this one, which I've previously reviewed, the Sega 6-button model MK1653. This is the model MK1470, which is even smaller than this one. But it has a larger row of buttons on the bottom.
possibly for greater comfort, possibly just to look interesting. It also has turbo and slow, as well as a mode button and a start button, which is blue. But you won't be blue when playing this. These may look nearly identical, but take a close-up look and you'll see they have different body styling, which doesn't affect gameplay at all. I'm just mentioning it because it's there. Also, the D-pad on this one is elevated slightly more than the D-pad on the 1653. That's astounding. With so many Sega Genesis controllers to choose from, which one is the one for you? Well, it depends if you like a larger controller or a smaller controller, if you want 6 buttons or 3 buttons. Do you want turbo? I don't know. I can't answer that for you. This is one of the smallest Sega controllers I've seen, yet it's very comfortable. Fits in my hands nicely. Standard, typical Sega Genesis style D-pad over here. Slightly textured plastic. Very comfortable design. I like the larger A, B, and C buttons. When you're playing a game like Cosmic Carnage, which is a fighting game, you want to be able to tell right away what you're doing. Punching, kicking, using your mutant tail to rip people's heads off. Larger buttons versus smaller buttons help you do that. Little selector switch here for turbo and slow. This one has been QC passed by 4, and it's made in China. I don't particularly care for the coloring on it, and this is starting to get a little complicated. They really got away from the sleek, smooth design of the original one with these other kind of, spaceship-looking plastic ovals and stuff on here. Starting to look a bit like a Sega Saturn controller. Let's take a close-up look at these buttons here. You see that they're labeled A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, which many of the 32X Sega CD and later Sega Genesis games used. There's that slight texture on the D-pad, textured plastic shell except for the reflective part up here. All in all, it's not one of their best-looking gamepads, one of their best-looking controllers, but still very solid. Typical high Sega build quality, and it works well. That's what's important. The model MK1740. Let's make sure I actually read that right. 1470. That's what I meant. The model MK1470. The 1740 is the one with the chainsaw on the front of it. Yeah, you can't just get that anywhere. This was donated to Classic Game Room by Frank in California, along with the Sega 32X and a bunch of games. So thank you, Frank. And just to clarify to everybody, you don't need a 32X to use this 6-button controller or any other 6-button controller. They will work just fine for Sega Genesis games that require 3 buttons. In fact, this thing will even work on your Atari 2600. It'll just use 1 button.
This is my original black PlayStation 3 6-axis controller, which after many years of faithful service finally started to develop some issues with the buttons. So that gave me the perfect excuse to pick up the red PlayStation 3 DualShock 3 controller. It's red. It also carries an abhorrently high price tag, but it's red. And very few people know this, but it does more than just play video games and look red. It also controls an El Camino. The red DualShock 3 controller has all of these 6-axis functions. It's wireless, it works with the PlayStation 3 of course, and it vibrates, bringing that tactile sensation into games, something the standard 6-axis controller did not do.
That's right, it's not Knight Rider that you're watching. This is the classic Game Room El Camino being controlled by the red PlayStation 3 DualShock 3 controller. How does it do it? It does it because it's red. Now, as far as I know, this doesn't work with every DualShock 3 controller or every El Camino out there. You need to have a DualShock 3 controller that's in sync with your El Camino. Now, how does one go about doing that? It's magic. The triangle button will eventually launch surface-to-air missiles, and the circle button will automatically order food from Burger King, so that you can then drive through the drive-thru in the back of the El Camino without even having to roll down the window or anything. You just hold out your hand and get the food and drive on. It's the greatest invention ever. The red DualShock 3 PlayStation 3 controller, which also plays games just like the black PlayStation 3 controller or the blue one. But this one is red, therefore, it controls El Caminos. Maybe yours. If you see your El Camino driving away with me laughing, holding this controller, you know what happened.
Welcome to Classic Game Room. The Atari 2600 controller isn't perfect. It falls over, it wobbles, it slides around the table. If only there was something to prevent that from happening. Well, now there is, because I have the stick stand, which increases the size of my Atari 2600 joystick. There's nothing to be ashamed about. It's happened to all of us. You're playing a sweaty, aggressive game of Berserk on your Atari 2600, only to find out that you can't keep your controller upright because the base is too small. Look at this thing. What good does it do? Well, that's what the stick stand is for. Put your Atari 2600 controller in there, and it increases the size of the base, making it nearly impossible to knock over. The stick stand. The stick stand is indeed a miracle of science and technology. Let's watch how it performs while playing Berserk on Atari 2600. I guess technically my 7800, but let's go to version 5. Bring it, stupid robots! Woo! Whoops, no. The stick stand, made in the USA. Patent still pending. Works with your Atari 2600 joysticks, increasing the surface area, sort of, or at least the size of your base. I think the rubber things might be bigger too, so technically that would make my first statement correct. It definitely works. Evil Otto, you suck! Oh. Here's a demonstration. Barely any force at all. The Atari joystick wobbles around, and it's pretty terrible. That's why most of us play games like this. But if you want to have it on the table like a joystick, you really want the stick stand. It's such a simple idea, but it does work. Look. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was, preventing your controller from falling over in the middle of heated combat.
The increase in performance that you may see with the stick stand will only be as good as the quality of your Atari 2600 joystick to begin with. And this happens to be the best one that I have out of all of my Atari joysticks. The beige one that came with the Atari XCGS computer is the best. And as silly as this review might be, if you like to play with your Atari controller on a surface like a joystick, the stick stand really does work. While it does grip the controller tightly, you'll still want to keep a hand on it for additional support, even though I still prefer the Sega Genesis controller. The stick stand does the job of standing your stick.
Stick stand.
While playing Atari 2600, and I've got a Classic Game Room shout out and thank you going to Eric, once again from Pasadena, California. Thank you for sending not one, but 2 stick stands.
Oops.
To the show. These definitely increase the Atari awesomeness of the intergalactic space arcade.
Oh no! Evil Otto, he doesn't appreciate the stick stand. Just look what happens if I take the stick stand off this thing. I died instantly. The stick stand is durable, plastic, washable, can double as a dog food bowl, and has a little slot here for your Atari 2600 controller wire. Look at that. Gives it a nice snug fit. No more wobbling. No more disappointment. This thing's better than the Allen 9000. Oh yeah! Get some! Tag! Oh, yeah! Gives it more surface area. And that increases pleasure.
Years ago, I reviewed this bad boy, the Gamepad 6 by Performance for the Sega Genesis, which was a really nice gamepad. Great buttons, auto fire, nice D-pad, a good aftermarket alternative to the classic Sega Genesis controller. But now, I have the Gamepad 6 by Performance for Super Nintendo, which is nearly identical to the Gamepad 6 by Performance for Sega Genesis, except it's for the Super Nintendo. So instead of playing Truxton and Musha, it plays Super Metroid and Mario Kart, and that's okay. Those are good games, also. To be honest, I like this controller a lot. It reminds me of the Sega Saturn gamepad. It has a similar style, even though the buttons are totally different. The D-pad is really nice on this controller, and so are the buttons. They're soft and round. They're luscious. Especially when combined with auto-fire. That makes them auto-luscious, which I shall now coin as a new word. This controller is Lando with a bit of the auto-luscious. Additionally, if you're using one of the aftermarket Nintendos or the Retron 5, which I use frequently, this will also play NES games and Game Boy. You have no shortage of options when choosing aftermarket Super Nintendo controllers. And as you can see, it takes the L and the R buttons from the top of the Super Nintendo controller and places them on the front in the 6-button array, which is far superior for fighting games like Street Fighter 2. So yes, this is a great option for an aftermarket SNES gamepad, even though there's many other choices out there. And here I am using the Gamepad 6 to play some games for upcoming classic game room reviews. Sadly, it can't make this game sound any better. No! Great game. Terrible music. Oh, it's very painful. I've been playing a variety of games with it. I like this thing. Woo! So thanks to David from Ohio for sending it to the show in space. David also sent this to the show. Isn't that some amazing cartridge artwork right there? That just screams 80s action game, and I love it. Woo-hoo-hoo! Take your ballet somewhere else, baddies. Yeah! I got like the Van Damme spin kick. This game's good. Let's go. I will punch out my enemies until they die. Using auto-fire. Luscious auto-fire. Gamepad 6 works well with FC Twin and Ikari 3. The Rescue! Rescue by killing with auto-luscious. What? Bet you didn't expect to see this one coming onto the show. Being played with the Gamepad 6. Super Aquatic Games. I thought the Aquabats were a group. Autofire really helps with this game. Look at me go.
It's like track and field with the Advantage. Except what is that? That fish? It looks like an orange Yoshi. Gamepad 6 brings victory when you cheat. Arrow the Acrobat. I'm like Sonic the Hedgehog if a hedgehog was a bat. And not as good. Sega. It's a nice controller. Good for the Super Nintendo, good for the Nintendo. Highly recommended Gamepad 6 by Performance with the Autoluscious. I have no idea how to play this game yet, but the Gamepad 6 by Performance is a great Super Nintendo controller. So a big classic game room shout out and thank you to David from Springfield, Ohio. Thank you for sending Gamepad 6 by Performance and a whole lot of Tekken games to the show. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get back to trying to figure out how to play Arrow the Acrobat. What are you doing? No! No, it took away my speed! You jerks! I love that none of the enemies are attacking me with guns. This is a very poorly funded enemy army. No! Thanks to my mullets, I will regenerate! If you're going to rock the Panasonic 3DO game console with such awesome games as Nova Storm and Blade Force, then guess what you'll need in addition to a Panasonic 3DO that works? A Panasonic 3DO controller. The gamepad, look at this. It's what would happen if a Sega Genesis controller mated with a Super Nintendo gamepad. Note the big curvy grip things for your hands, 3-button layout, a pause play button, stop, and what's that, a headphone jack? Oh yeah, try doing this with your Sega Genesis controller. You'll break something. That's right, now you can listen to your Panasonic 3DO from the comfort of your own couch if you don't have speakers. But if you can afford one of these, odds are you can afford speakers. So maybe it's just for convenience and privacy. It's actually kind of neat, but no doubt added to the astronomical cost of this thing back when it was new. There's even a little volume control. How's that sound? The 3DO controller comes with a generous amount of cord, and here's the plug, which looks remarkably similar to what you'll find on the Sega Genesis, Atari 2600, ColecoVision, or Vectrex, but it's not exactly the same. I tried using a Genesis controller on this. Doesn't work. There, now you're all plugged in, ready to play some Panasonic 3DO video games, which are pretty awesome from what I've seen. It boldly says Panasonic right on the front. There's the 3DO logo. Comfortable buttons, comfortable design. It feels like a Genesis controller. But, or like a larger Super Nintendo gamepad. You got 2 buttons up here. See that? There's a hidden surprise beneath this thing. Hey now. It's an extension port, which is convenient considering the Panasonic 3DO only has one controller port on the unit. You could daisy chain up to 8 controllers together. Most importantly, the Panasonic 3DO controller is comfortable and familiar. For anyone who's played video games, you can pick this thing up and get right into games like Road Rash. You can play for a long time. It's just got that Sega Genesis controller feel. It's about the same size, and the D-pad is similar. As you can see, it's, well, looks like a lighter gray version of the Genesis D-pad. Here's the buttons, which are also easy to push, big, comfortable. These 2 buttons in the middle are kind of odd to work the menus, and then the ones up here can be used occasionally. And that's about it. It's kind of unattractive, but it's comfortable. That's what's important. Now let me get this straight. I can daisy chain Panasonic 3DO controllers together? Well, by that logic, I should be able to daisy chain a Vectrex controller onto the Panasonic 3DO controller, thereby playing Panasonic 3DO games, if I could plug this in the right way, on my Vectrex. Wait. That doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. Well, just because I'm pretty sure this is the first time anyone's actually done this in history. Here we go. Panasonic 3DO controller connected to a Vectrex controller. What happens if I push this button? Absolutely nothing. Boy, that Vectrex controller looks nice though, doesn't it? Yeah, that's how you build them. Look at that thing. Oh, sorry, I forgot about you. Panasonic 3DO controller. Hey, thanks to our good friend Mohammed in Qatar for donating the unit and the controller, hooking the show up with an endless supply of Panasonic 3DO games. Now I gotta try playing him with this thing. I'll let you know what happens. I tried it. It turned the universe backwards. So Road Rash becomes Hishadar. And it's really fun. Thanks to using the Zertkev.
This review has been approved by Lord Carnage. Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the Intergalactic Space Arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. It's the mightiest controller that I've ever seen. 2 massive joysticks, around 40 buttons, and pedals. It's the controller for Steel Battalion on the original Xbox released in 2002. A controller that puts all other controllers to shame. It's a controller so massive I had to break out another table just to use it. This thing dwarfs the X-Arcade tank stick. Sure, the tank stick is heavier, but it doesn't have pedals. Steel Battalion does. This reminds me of my years playing MechWarrior. Back in the early 90s. Love that game. Except this is a whole hell of a lot bigger. Hey, what's this?
Oscar 3 here. I read you, Argus.
Shut up! This controller is absolutely ridiculous, but that's exactly what you want when you're piloting a giant robot and stomping on things, which is what you do in Steel Battalion. But be forewarned, it barely fits into the Intergalactic Space Arcade, and we have lots of room, so it's most likely going to completely dominate your dorm room. You're a waste of giant robotic resources. And you know how you just got that new apartment with your significant other? How sweet! They can sleep outside, make room for this thing. Just look at all the cool things it does when starting your mech. This is an amazing controller that looks and feels the part. It's as if you're really driving a 10-story giant robot destroying things, even when you're not. The only problem is that it's big, expensive, and doesn't seem to work with too many other games. In fact, I think only one other game. Fortunately, Steel Battalion is really good, so once you start playing, it's hard to stop, and you certainly can't go back to playing giant mech games with a measly controller. So, really, you might want to avoid this thing. It'll just spoil you for the rest of your life. Nothing will ever be the same. Your car now sucks compared to this. It's not just that it's big and cool, it's that they put so much time into making this thing. It looks like it came straight out of a giant mech. There's nice aesthetic touches and details everywhere. The buttons all light up when you get hit. The joysticks and controllers actually work. And short of maybe a giant cockpit simulator, I can't think of anything that would have complemented Steel Battalion better than this. Although I'm sure it cost a fortune. So, should you buy one of these? Well, not without the game. It originally came packaged with Steel Battalion, and if you buy Steel Battalion, make sure you get the Steel Battalion controller. It's the only thing that will control the game. So is the game any good? Well, I'm working on the full video game review, which you'll be able to see soon on the internet and on the Best of Classic Game Room 15th Anniversary Collection. I'll tell you it's a good game, but this controller just knocks it out of the park. As long as you have the room for it, do not underestimate how large the Steel Battalion controller is. You might actually have an easier time parking a real mech in your home. So I've got a giant, enormous robot armed with machine guns and missile launchers sized thank you to send to David from Brooklyn, New York. Thank you, David. Thank you for sending the game and this controller, which will now ruin every other controller review for the rest of time because nothing can compare to this. If you're gonna play Steel Battalion, which you should, not only are you going to want the Steel Battalion controller, but you're going to need it.
Did I step on him? What's that thing? Dead. That's what it is. It's dead. It's the Logitech Driving Force GT wheel for racing games on the PlayStation 3, PC, and PlayStation 2. A versatile and affordable force feedback wheel that comes with your basic driving pedals, gas, and brake. The wheel itself is well appointed with all of the buttons that you need to enjoy PlayStation 3 and 2 games. It's comfortable with a rubbery surface and has 2 paddle shifters on the reverse side of the wheel. The 2 knobs on top work with grips underneath to affix the wheel to a coffee table, TV tray, or playseat, which is what I have it hooked up to here. There's a shift knob on the right side of the platform, which feels pretty cheap and just clicks back and forth. It gets the job done if that's what you want to use. Personally, I prefer the paddle shifters. The wheel's performance is quite good. It gives adequate force feedback, and I use it for all of my driving games now, Gran Turismo 5, iRacing, Dirt 3. I love that it works on the PlayStation 2 as well because there's a ton of driving games for the PS2. The pedals do feel a bit cheap, and I have used the Logitech G27. That is a much better wheel, but it will also cost you more money. While the wheel does a decent job simulating a real driving experience with its force feedback, the pedals are way too soft and don't actually feel like you're driving a car. They feel like video game pedals. However, for the price, I think you get a good deal because it works on the PC, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 2. It uses a USB cable and also has a power supply for the force feedback. You Xbox 360 owners will have to buy a completely different wheel. And no, this does not work for Super Monaco GP on the Genesis. If cost is no object for you, I would look up at the Logitech G27, which gives you a clutch pedal and shifter that can be mounted on the side of your playseat if you're using a playseat. If you're on a budget or just don't want to spend all that much, the Driving Force GT does an excellent job for the price. Check to see if your favorite games are supported. I've used it for iRacing, Gran Turismo 3, 4, 5, Need for Speed Shift, Dirt 3, and NASCAR 2011. And there's a little spike plate under the pedals to keep them in place if you're using them on the carpet. It's the Logitech Driving Force GT. From Dobie Fomus Electronics comes the controller grip used for the left and right of Switch Joy-Con. From Dobie. That logo looks somewhat familiar, doesn't it? My favorite part of this is that this is for the N Switch. The N Switch, not the Nintendo Switch. The N Switch. Gosh, it looks like the Nintendo Switch. Maybe it's for NSYNC. Hopefully not. You can pick this up for just a couple bucks. I found this on Amazon, and it does work like a boss. You fit your little Joy-Con in there, and these buttons push the buttons on your Joy-Con, and you can easily remove it. See? Pretty fascinating, actually. And I find this way too small to actually use, even with the other attachment they give you with your Switch. With the wrist strap thing. These little buttons on top here that you need for Mario Kart for sliding around corners. Comes with 2 joysticks. Just plug it in there, boom! You've got a little miniature joystick. It's actually very nice. The packaging is ridiculous. It looks cheap, and it probably is cheap. It feels fine though. Especially if you have adult hands. You see, it makes it a lot bigger. Okay, let me show you an example. Hopefully you've seen my review of this game. Perhaps you've heard of it. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and I'll play it with the Joy-Con using the controller grip from Dobie. Dobie. Let's fire this up. And I have unlocked a vehicle customization option, the Duke. Alright. Everyone ready? The controller grip comes with 2 controller grips, one for each of your Joy-Cons, so that's nice. And it really does make it much larger for adult hands. I mean, the button placement's still kind of weird, but it's better than it was.
Oh yeah. Yeah, feel that beat. Dobie. The logo reminds me of a cross between Sony and Bose. These controller grips are actually really nice because they're so simple yet effective. They just make your Joy-Cons bigger, and they actually make them feel like modern controllers. And if you have adult hands, if you don't have like little Smurf hands, if you have adult hands, these work quite well for $10-15. You know, if you check on Amazon, they have a bunch of different brands. This is the Dobie brand, which is very close to Adobe, but they don't make Photoshop. They make these little controller things. There's a close-up of your Joy-Con, and here's the grips without controllers. There's really not a whole lot to them. That's why they're cheap. So if you get a Switch, you get 2 built-in controllers for free after you pay for your Switch, and you can use that for Mario Kart and all kinds of other games, Street Fighter 2. You totally want these. Because the Joy-Cons, even though they sell those like little things that you slide on with the wrist straps, they suck. They're really not that good. And the Joy-Cons themselves are just way too small. So check these out. Hunt these things down. The shoulder buttons are so much better than just trying to use the Joy-Cons by themselves. Play Switch with your friends, by yourself, with your pets, using the Dobie. I already forgot what they're called. The controller bigger thingies.
So if you like the Joy-Cons, but you find them too small, and you don't want to invest in one of the Nintendo Switch Pro controllers, which are pretty expensive, go for this thing. These things. There's a pair of them. They're even cheaper than the Hori wired controller I just reviewed. And they don't give you an additional controller, but they do make the controllers that you already have bigger, and that makes them better. Let's take a close-up scientific view at the innards. That's what it does. It pushes buttons so you don't have to, even though you have to, in order for it to do... Never mind, you get the idea. I guess you can put your own sticker there. The box comes with 2 of these things. They're just plastic with buttons. That's all they are. They're pretty simple. And you can easily remove your Joy-Con and put it back on your Switch. Alright, thanks for watching. See you later.
I have long desired to fight with you. Come now.
With the power of Knock-Attack.
Welcome to Classic Game Room, where I bring you the review of the Knock-Attack gamepad for the Panasonic 3DO, which can survive a drop onto a concrete floor because it withstood the Classic Game Room I'm clumsy test and still works.
What's that now? You've started collecting for the excellent Panasonic 3DO, or you've revived your old collection and need a new controller? It's time to knock 'em the fuck out with Knock-Attack. That's their official slogan. Poorly translated. This is an aftermarket controller for the 3DO, one that feels and looks nearly identical to the actual Panasonic brand 3DO controller, with an extra port to plug in your Atari or Sega Genesis controllers. I'm just kidding. You can daisy chain your 3DO controllers together because they only put one controller port on the 3DO. Kind of a silly design if you ask me. I'm not really sure what the 5 or 6 switch does, but we do have turbo fire, auto fire, slow down, and a pause and play button, as well as a comfortable D-pad and functional A, B, and C buttons. And that cool logo. Remember the commercials? When you need to knock them the fuck out, you knock a deck. It's all one word. That's how they got by censors. Considering how hard it is to find a working 3DO these days and how much of a niche product it actually is or was, I don't think I knew anybody back in the day that had a 3DO. It's extremely easy to collect games and accessories for. And there's a lot of great games, a surprising number of good games on the 3DO, like Samurai Showdown, which is nearly as good as the Neo Geo MVS version. Not quite as smooth, but it plays very well using the Nakatech 3DO controller. Those of you with sharp eyes may have noticed my Neo Geo monitor missing in the previous shot. That's right, it's finally being repaired. The Nakatech controller is a very straightforward gamepad. It feels a lot like the Sega Genesis gamepad, which I think was an inspiration for the standard Panasonic 3DO gamepad in the first place. While it's not the most stylish controller out there, I like the row of turbofire switches on the front of it. Destroy that thing. Yeah! Power of Nakatech, blowing things up with an F-14. It's like the dashboard of Airwolf. If Airwolf was an F-14 that could go back in time and stomp on dinosaurs. No! The Nakatech failed me that time. For the last time. How about this stack of awesome games? There's so many great ones to choose from, and the Nakatech 3DO controller will play them. Ah! What's going on? Ah!
It's classic game room time where I bring you the review of the Nakatech aftermarket controller for the PlayStation. No, it's 3DO.
You have effectively eliminated all alien invaders in the Valley of the Kings.
Using the Nakatech 3DO controller, no less. So a big thanks to my man Mohammed from Qatar for sending the 3DO and a bunch of accessories to the show. Maybe even this one. I'm not sure. I got our collections mixed up, so he just gets credit for everything. They had hot chicks on the 3DO. Back before they used CGI for everything, they used real actors. Is that Laura Linney? No, it's not actually. Oh, friggin' aliens! Eat laser! I'm doing this for Laura. Somebody should tell him it's not her. Regardless, this game is great and plays well with the Nakatech 3DO controller.
This isn't a game, Lieutenant.
She's pretty easy on the eyes when she's yelling at you. You fire lasers and missiles using the buttons, drive around with the D-pad and accelerate and brake with the little buttons on front. It works like it should. And if you don't have a real Panasonic controller, you can always knock them the fuck out with Nakatech. I did a barrel roll. Just look at the packaging on these things. Plastic, instruction manuals tucked in, ads for road rash. It's the greatest thing ever. Shockwave! Not just a transformer anymore.